Today we've got two lectures as usual. One is by me on, I suppose you would say it's on Rem Koolhaas and OMA, but also on those guys in relationship to conceptions of the city. Because I think that the view that Koolhaas brought in design terms to thinking about the city through both his writing and his practice have changed the way, or have for some people changed the way you see the city, and particularly you see the project in the city, and also are very critical of urban design as a mode of practice. And so it's both a critique of urban design and an approach to the city that we're talking about. Afterwards, Matteo is going to talk about parametric urbanism, which to some extent is related to Koolhaas's practice in ways that Matteo can elucidate. But what I want to start by talking about first is the Netherlands, and I think it's important to do that because of the fact that Koolhaas's practice, it's a position from which he operates, and I think it gives you a good context about how things work. And so, essentially, the Netherlands is an invented landscape, and so what we're really talking about is the fact that the Netherlands developed, the people in the Netherlands developed methods of what's known as poldering between about 1000 AD up until, and it's still underway, and so that they were basically able to inhabit an area that was not, strictly speaking, land originally. And so that process of land reclamation and migration undertaken by manipulating natural systems is the foundation for the Netherlands. And that means that in the Netherlands, the idea of artificiality and making the landscape artificially is a fundamental part of being Dutch, and a lot of Dutch, the expression, God made the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands, is an expression that they like to utilise to describe that. And so, for example, here is Amsterdam, and you can see in this axonometric how far down, compared to this water level, you can see how via a series of processes, by the time we're this far away from that water level, we're, potentially six metres underwater, essentially. And so this reclamation process and making of the landscape is quite fundamental. And, essentially when you look at an image like that, what you're seeing is the previous edge of a lake, which has been filled in around it to the point where, in a way, you can't see what would have once been water and what would have once been land. And then the whole landscape is, in fact, synthetic in some sense. And that means that in design also there has been a history of, there's been arguments made that this process of poldering and this sort of artificiality of the landscape is tied to the art movements of De Stael, etc. And so it's part of both a landscape character and an approach to dealing with natural systems, which is highly manipulative, as well as a kind of cultural space. So the poldering is a technology, but it's also a cultural thing. And so I think, if we look at the sort of that process, you can see here how over time, through the process of creating these smaller bodies of water and isolating areas and building dikes and filling in, there's been a sort of a process of reclamation that starts by the creation of a dike to separate separate one side from another, one water body from another, and then inside that they get filled in. And so in that context, a process like that can take 100 years, to the point where, this landscape is not just made in a sort of sense of it's artificial, but it's also then, obviously then the site of development and various models for urbanism for dealing with that reclaimed land, have also been developed that reflect whatever the sort of approach to urbanism of that period. And so if we look at this polder in the IJsselmeer, then we can see that in the 1960s and 70s, when the city was being conceived of in a sort of a metabolic sense, we can start to see in the developments on top of that artificial land, we can start to see how ideas about the city as a system, as a metabolism, and its geometries of sort of hexagons, etc., come out, until finally, by the time it's actually built, it's happening in the period of postmodernism, and then it's sort of imposing inside that metabolist structure, on top of that water engineering that happened at the turn of the century. You can start to see how ideas from postmodernism end up playing out on that landscape in terms of ideas about urban morphology and perimeter blocks, etc., until finally, when the actual things are constructed now, potentially 80 years after the original land reclamation, through all those processes, we have projects like this by Koolhaas and Pontonzemenet. How do you pronounce that guy? You know, the guy, the French architect. Pottermac. You know the guy I'm talking about. And so anyway, so this is a master plan on top of this, which is the idea of here is the ground, the real ground level, and then this is a sort of a brown facade here, and to demonstrate that this land should be underwater. And that's the original level, so they've got these green roofs that reflect that, and then everything underneath is expressed in this language. So what I'm saying is that we need to think about the idea that the landscape, that Koolhaas is coming from a very strong urbanistic culture, a very strong artificial culture in terms of its approach to landscape. So it's not like his approach is so radical just because of the fact that he was a radical thinker. It's also because he comes from a position that recognises the city as a constructed thing on a constructed landscape. And I think there's one just development that I'd like to quickly talk about, which is not special. It's just an example of how planning systems operate in the Netherlands, to give you a sense of that sort of rationality, because there's been the argument made that the way that the Dutch approach urbanism is fundamentally different. And we've got a lecturer at the end who was supposed to be speaking actually this week, Hedwig, who will talk about the Dutch approaches to urban design in more detail. But I'll just explain this one site that I stayed in for a period of time when I was doing some work up near Groningen for about in the north, in Friesland, for about 3 months, and I stayed in a spot in amongst this development. Just to, rather than talk about it from that way, one thing you can see obviously is how important water movement and organisation is to deal with developing a landscape like that. So infrastructure of traffic and infrastructure of water are built at the same time. And within those structures of water is also, that becomes the kind of natural system. And so if we look at the place where I was staying, you'll see that basically the structure is that, for example, you know, I'm staying in one of these places here. If we look across them, you'll see that a series of them are organised in this way. The water body comes along the side. There's parking out on one side and then garden spaces on the middle of them, and the water system and a path system runs next to it. And as you move along that line through there, you see how, in a way, water is used as amenity, but also that the planting that occurs on the edge of these places along here has a role. And so, for example, along the side of one of these water bodies is this path, and then when you get onto that path, which is this one here, you move into a kind of like a immersive space where you're actually feeling like you're in the wilderness, but you're in a channel that's basically about 15 metres wide, with dense self-regenerating vegetation on either side that is screening off everything around you, so you feel while you're riding your bike like you're in the forest, but you're actually just in a tiny little fragment that's linked to water, that's linked into a road system, that's linked into a building system. And so that sense where you set up a band, where in one direction, this is something we'll come back to, in one direction the band is autonomous, which is to say that when you're inside this this band of vegetation, that's your world. It's running straight and you run through its length. But then other activities sort of meet those bands and often cross those bands, such as here when a piece of infrastructure crosses that. So that thing about interweaving of bands and the juxtaposition of those things to create sort of contradiction is something that appears a lot in Koolhaas's work. And then, this sort of approach to the sort of organisation of things and the planning of every square metre of space continues in a kind of language of separating functions in the roadway, etc. And even when you get into the mall, for example, in town, it's all ridiculously cutesy. This thing is these pavers have one side which is polished and one side which is rough, and so this pattern just comes through by playing with which side of the paver you place upwards or downwards. And so that sort of idea of common sense and using, for instance, this is a diagram where when there's a crossing coming, they, for example, change the bond in the paving to meet the next street. And so it's a super logical system where it almost can seem like its qualities are almost a byproduct of common sense in a way. And so there's a book that I've got that I get a lot of my stuff here around, which is a book called In Praise of Common Sense, which is really about Dutch planning. So that's the background that's a sort of an example of how Dutch urban design thinking has occurred. Now let's sort of dash into Koolhaas and talk about some of his work and where he comes from. And we're talking really about a period where he was educated in the 1970s, and he calls himself a 1968 child. 68 was the year when the student revolutions in Paris were occurring. And so during this time, Koolhaas, who had been a journalist, moved to London to study at the Architectural Association. And Koolhaas is here with Madeline Friesendorp, who was his wife, and Elia and Zoe Zangelis, and they were originally OMA, the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. And at that time, really what was happening in the Architecture Association in London, which was a kind of avant-garde school, was kind of hippie stuff around the students had to teach themselves, around participation, etc. And so these guys had a much more sort of punk rock sort of approach. And so he talks about how, he had to develop his own position on architecture because what was happening in the place was so not what he was interested in. And so the project that he did at that time, which was quite interesting, was called Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, in 1972, and it was really about the Berlin Wall. And Berlin was a really important part of his urbanistic thinking. And so what he was really interested in was how this really banal thing of a wall could actually really change, could cause such great effects, but in itself the wall was incredibly banal. And so if you had to describe it as a piece of architecture, he would describe it as a kind of model of architecture. And a lot of this is about understanding his position to the world and to the social, which we'll talk about, which I think is still relevant now. So here you can see that on the Berlin Wall you have kids playing next to it. You have, a wedding potentially happening here where the other family is on the other side of the Berlin Wall, waving to each other. And then you have this strange space between the two, and the photography of it that Koolhaas undertook almost takes aestheticization of it. And so the project itself, starts with the wall as a sort of a banal thing, and then looks at how it creates program. And that idea of program is really fundamental. And so just to describe what it is, so you can understand how it sits in relationship to Koolhaas's thinking. If we think about modernist architecture and planning and zoning, for example, you could say that was programmed. And in a way that's talking about land use, zoning, and the idea that a certain function occurs in a certain place. If we think about the sort of popular discourses of modern architecture, of form follows function, etc., the idea that function of a piece of land should be the expression of it, so that in the modernist city, the diagram of the city was the diagram of the zoning. And so in a way you have a relationship where the function is expressed in the shape of the city. But instead, by using the term program, it's really talking about function as event. And this is a really important idea. And so instead of it being function as a kind of form-driven thing, it's function as an event or an activity that occurs in time. And with that in mind, a lot of the time, Koolhaas's work was about setting up systems or frameworks that would cause programs to coexist in a complex way. And so I'll come back to this over and over, because if we think about a lot of what we've seen previously in urban design, it's been around either the segregation of land use as the expression of a diagram, the street, etc., whereas he was interested in how different programs and events could not be designed, but could be in a way caused to conflict with each other, to produce contradictions, to produce strange things. And so for him, as much as the wall is the tool for it, or as much as the wall is the thing that's causing it, the kind of conjunction between this uniform monolithic element and the context creates all of these events and things that occur along that edge. But it's done by something really banal, a piece of wall that's got the same detail all the way along it. And so here we have a hint about his kind of approach and why it's interesting. Now, during this time, after he left the Architecture Association, what he really focused on was, he said, I didn't yet know how to do a piece of architecture. So he'd finished a diploma at the Architecture Association. He'd done this building here, this kind of unbuilt project, and it's a period of time where, Koolhaas was doing this stuff for 20 years before he built anything. So you can see how it's a speculative thing. So it's analytical and propositional. It's not saying that this is literally the proposition. It's in a way working from a kind of reading into a kind of proposition as testing, which is a kind of sort of a design research angle. And so what happened at this point is that he decided to go to Cornell to learn architecture, because this guy O.M. Ungers was in Cornell at that time. And Ungers was very much an architect. And so Ungers had an interesting approach where, for instance, I've got some nice quotes from Ungers here. Let me pull them out. So he's talking about architecture, like for instance, for Ungers, architecture or design, the thing that you make, is always coming from your own discipline. It's always coming, and so you could say the same thing for planning, you could say the same thing from landscape architecture. We have things that we do. It's probably different for planning, actually. And so on the other hand, all of the things that you do have that he would argue, and I kind of agree, they exist within the realm of your own discipline, and the effects were actually almost an outcome, a byproduct of what they were. And so this is an important idea, because in a way, if we go to the next part of the semester, we're going to be talking to practitioners who are working in Africa specifically or generally, and in Cape Town specifically. And so in a way, the role of ideology in practice and how it gets expressed is really important. And so the proposition that architecture can do something socially, or that landscape or planning can do something socially, is a proposition that we might take for granted. But for Koolhaas and for Ungers, that's not true. They would have said that in actual fact it's almost a byproduct. And so in a way, one thing that Ungers and Koolhaas were both interested in was the city as an urban condition. So on the one hand, they're analysing the city and they're reading the city, and they're reading architecture and design's relationship to it, but at the same time, they're not doing it to make their architecture copy the city, or they're looking at how architecture responds to conditions and creates conditions. I think that's a really important sort of idea that they have. And so if we look at sort of an example of how this works, one of the projects that is very important for this period and for Koolhaas in 77, Ungers and Koolhaas undertake a project which is called the city in a city, a green archipelago. And so one of the main things that they're looking at in this is really how to deal with the fact that the city is decreasing in size, and that's actually the least relevant part of this story. It was really, if you consider that Berlin at that time was divided by the Berlin Wall, and so therefore the city was in these pockets and didn't have any room to move. But probably the most important thing that they were really focused on was, in a way, something that comes through a lot in that period, which is the city is too big for a single idea. This is a really important thing. If you think about people like Ebenezer Howard or Le Corbusier, they are trying to suggest that the city is a uniform thing, that design can handle it and harness it, and that we can deal with it completely. But instead, what Ungers and Koolhaas will continue to always say is it's too complex to be governed by one idea. And so for their project in the Green Archipelago, what they're really looking at is this idea of something that we might now call polycentrism, which is a recognition that because the city is too big for a single idea, in a way we need to work on a whole series of points within the city and work on these as almost little worlds that then will collide with other systems. And the things that they were particularly looking at was the idea that, and this is where they're straddling, and Koolhaas and Ungers are straddling postmodernism, is they're talking about the idea of character units, that essentially a precinct or a place or a little miniature city has its own particular character that arises. And then after that, there is a space created between the sort of the cities that is basically a container for infrastructure and for natural systems. And so instead of the city being a kind of complete totality, it's a series of these little moments of cities that is sitting within a body of green that is then navigated with infrastructure. And so that was the model that came out of that, which in a way was some of the least, which in a way was unusually conventional for Koolhaas to some extent. But this is the part where Koolhaas in a way is starting to learn about what architecture is. Now, in Ungers' practice, he was also quite interested in this idea of how different sorts of existing building fragments and characters can be attached to each other. And so the work that he and Koolhaas both worked with was this idea of a kind of harmonious contradiction, which is the idea that there can be difference simultaneous to the way that difference comes together and makes a whole. And this is important because this is a time where one of the main problems that was happening in urbanism was about how to deal with old cities in Europe, and therefore questions about historic character and how you deal with them were really important. And so this approach of contradiction, or what Koolhaas called oxymorons, is a really important approach, because it's starting to recognise that the city is too big and diverse to be able to be dealt with in a consistent sort of way. And instead we should be focusing on the factors that cause things to happen. After this period, because he was in Cornell, which was near New York State, and this is Ungers here, he then went on to work on a project which is called Delirious New York. And I put up a chapter from it. It's a terribly fun piece of reading, and I really recommend reading it. And so you'll see here something quite interesting, which is the sort of process by which he is looking at New York. And he calls it Delirious New York. Also, he does not use architectural terminology. So he's not talking about the architecture of New York. He's talking about how the sort of cultural conditions of New York produce certain sorts of things in the city. And so, for instance, he talks about this idea of, these three factors, and that and one of them is the reproduction of the world. And so, in other words, we're talking about the idea that in a place there could be a miniaturization of everything that creates a certain autonomy. And then it's talking about the tower as a separation sitting within the block. And so, in a way, what we're talking about is that the structure of the city has an urban morphology. It has a certain form. In New York, we're talking about the grid. But after that, inside that grid, there is enormous diversity that comes from this sort of inward-looking focus. And part of that arises, and this is probably the most interesting part for me, is that he articulates something which was happening in that in the development of New York, which is where, in a way, the architects and designers at the time working in New York were trying to think about how to get around the zoning laws that were precluding building high. And so obviously key technologies occurred, such as the elevator that allowed for a technology that allowed for verticality, construction techniques relating to sort of steel and concrete, initially steel, but then also the way that light worked, because a lot of these bylaws were about bringing light to the street, part of the kind of hygiene thing around the city. Therefore, through a process of design research, a lot of these, or particularly a guy called Ferris, was really looking at the ways that through building a diagram of light angles, through this could be generated a piece of form. So in a way, it arises from a diagramming and investigation of light angle and then gets stylized into this process. Now, this is something that's kind of similar to what Matteo's going to talk about, because this is a parametric approach. The parameter is light movement. After that, what the individual designers do almost doesn't matter, but here's your volume that I've been calling the performative volume, which is, in other words, something where it's like an outside, it's a max, but within the max, how you manipulate it is completely up to you. And so this is a process that was quite rigorously dealt with, and that's a process that we still, in effect, developers now still use, which is always to try to work out the max bulk you can put on a site, how constraints play out. But in a way, the work these guys were doing at that time was the intersection between planning policy and design and development occurring, but also with this cultural endeavour of each one of those is its own sort of world. Now, at this point, after this stage, Koolhaas is building a series of sort of projects, and those projects really are around, they're unbuilt projects. And if we look at this, we're talking about the fact that his first piece of built architecture is 20 years after he graduated, right? So the guy's born in 1940. And so in a way, he's 32 by the time he studies architecture, and he's 50 before he builds anything. I always use this. I mean, I've done lots of building, never the building I wanted to do. And so I still have this idea that my great project can still happen. But we all have that, don't we, right? But and so this, this project is probably one of the most famous projects that they did, and it's useful because it actually brings together a few ideas that should be starting to come through, which is that as much as anything, the work or the approach that Koolhaas, actually, which year is these ones? No, this is the right order. 85, 82. What we're talking about here is this idea of program, and so obviously we're playing between the scale of an individual site and the city as a larger system, and this is the scale that we're always going to be playing with when we talk about urban design and planning. Planning is ostensibly around more than an individual site. It's around the city. Landscape planning is similar with a more ecological angle, and urban design and architecture tends to be based around a client who has a piece of site. And so we're always in this fluctuation between projecting for a bigger system, thinking about an individual parcel, and we're moving always between those two. But at the same time, in the design for Parc La Villette, what they did was they came up with a system which was about immersion and difference. And so, for example, and I don't know, Matteo's is worth looking at on the site, OMA's new website. They've put up a whole lot of drawings from the design process on the website that were never available before. And so these drawings, for example, are the drawings the collages that happened in the office when they came up with the scheme that are available. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. All of these ones. And so what's interesting is that for me, this project's so talked about in urbanism that it's interesting, this stuff has never been available before. And so essentially what's happening is that they've got a series of these bands, and normally what we've had is these drawings that show what happened at the end, but it's interesting to see the collages and stuff that made them. But the approach really is this idea that each one of these bands is an immersive programmatic world. And so, for instance, it's a park, so one of these could be a cactus garden, the next one could be a rainforest, the next one could be a plantation. And because of the way that they're graded with mounds on either side, when you're walking along them, you are deeply in that world. And so you're isolated from the other worlds. But the circulation system actually crosses them. And so what then happens is it's like a staccato rhythm, where as you cross them, you're confronted with one world, next world, next world, next world. And so it's a thing about conflict and immersion. And I think that's their strategy. A lot of the time, that idea of strategy, which is, in a way, they don't even need to do the scheme. All they need to do is set up these rules, and whoever later on came in and do it could take over a band and do whatever they wanted, because it's that one juxtaposes against another. Why does this matter for an approach to the city? Is that this sort of strategic model, where you don't worry about the detail and you worry about the governing system, is the whole basis of what's come from that period. And in a way, that's also the way that planning works. Each one of those systems, in a way, is triggered. Each system triggers a response. You can't know what's happening on every lot. All you can know is what the system might produce, and the design is then a scenario or a test of that. And so, and you can see what's also, I mean, just in a design sense, what's nice is that it can start from something as simple as collage. And collage is a technique that I'm nostalgic about this stuff, and I love working with collage. And so this is a really interesting, the idea that it could start with a collage like that, where someone just sticks some strips down, and in the end it gets to the point where it's actually highly regulated within that strip system, and how it's also about layers and overlays. And again, Matteo will talk a bit about that afterwards. And so in other projects from that period, we can also see some things that... Oh no, that's all right. Come back to me. All right, okay. And so we can see some other things in here as well from the period which are interesting. So there's another project called, let me pronounce this right, Bilge Mermir, and that he did in the same sort of period. And it's interesting because that project is for a piece of modernist planned housing from this sort of metabolist period. So from the 1960s and 50s and 60s, it has this... was coming from this period of what's known as megastructure, which we talked about, where, in a way, the single building creates subspaces and smaller addresses and acts as a bigger regulating structure. And instead, to try to work with it, what Koolhaas and the OMA team did was you can see here's a collage of difference they put on top of it. What they then tried to do is overlay another structure within it of natural systems, for example, of other circulation systems, to, in a way, intervene into the existing structure to put diversity into it and specificity. Because a lot of the critique of these models is that they treat the ground plane as universal, so no buildings have a real address, and so there's no specificity for people living in them, and therefore the ground plane is not owned. It's not, you couldn't tell somebody what your address was quite in the same way. This is something that Tanya Kachner will talk about when she gives a lecture on planning, the planning backlash, and Jane Jacobs, because these kind of approaches, even though Koolhaas is coming at it from a different way, a critique of those sort of approaches had an enormous history in design, because it changed the perception, or it changed the way that people saw architecture, because ultimately this sort of universalising act, as much as it was about democracy, of the fact that everyone gets a flat and everybody gets access to land, ultimately personality and customisation and the ability to have, partial private ownership is really important. And so over here you can see how that project got developed via a characteristic things which we can start to see from Unger's here, which is the insertion of program, key moments of program. So you have one structure, which is the creation, for example, of the bands through it. And so banding being something that comes up a lot, which is a kind of access infrastructure system. You can see also the way that the natural systems are blended into it. And then at certain points, there are these range of buildings with program that create complexity by putting in those programs in juxtaposition. Similar thing to what he'd done in La Valette. But probably one of the most famous projects and one of the most important projects of this period was this one called Melun Senar. And it's important because of the fact that that it reveals a major change in how you would understand the city. And so in this situation here, what Koolhaas was proposing for the design of this place is that really you can see resemblances, so you can see that's the project, the Exodus project in there. But each of these bands were for different sorts of uses and different sorts of program. And so some of them were infrastructure, some of them were around green spaces. And so what instead he said is that the city cannot be controlled. The way it works is that you can't really master plan it, but what you can do is control the inverse. Decide what you want to, what's important to control, and just let the rest go. And so here he's saying in those bands, these are where key cultural institutions are and key things, and which he called voids. And then after that, the inverse will just do its own thing. And so this is an interesting strategy because it's recognising that there is a change in the way that the city is operating. So, each one of the, in a way also you can see the role of process, the role of layering as this is happening. And so ultimately he was interested in how those edges of those bands met the context more so than the context itself. So this is something also, if you think about Kevin Lynch, it's actually not so different if you think about Graham Shane. By now you should recognise the role of armature and the role of node and the role of edge, and start to see that we're talking about a model where the city is a mass and things are there are points or there are lines cutting through masses, and the edge of where the specific line meets the general mass is where the action happens. And so here you can see here is the way that the band is the void is designed to condition different sorts of edges where he's not interested in what's happening in there, only in how those intersect with that. And so that project, those three projects really demonstrate a period of time before Koolhaas really built anything. And what probably some of the main things that we're talking about in this period start to come out in other projects. And so this is an article that was called Whatever Happened to Urbanism. And I put it here because between the unbuilt stuff and the built stuff is a moment where, as a designer, he starts to realise that there's only so much a project can do. That the city is an entity that is growing on its own, and that there's really not much you can do with it. And so he starts this, Whatever Happened to Urbanism is kind of like an ode. And so he talks about this sort of, he calls it a losing battle of quantity. What he means by that in a way is that the city is growing so quickly that while we focus quantitatively on controlling the city just ignores that and keeps growing. And so in a way that quantitative massing of the city is a force that we are unable to control, and the process of trying to control it causes a lot of problems. And he talks about, and probably some of the main things to me, is that he says, pervasive urbanisation has modified the urban condition itself beyond recognition. The city no longer exists. As the concept of the city is distorted and stretched beyond precedent, each insistence on its primordial condition in terms of images, rules, fabrication, irrevocably leads via nostalgia to irrelevance. For urbanists, the belated rediscovery of the virtues of the classical city at the moment of its definitive impossibility was a point of no return. And so if you think about the fact that what he's analysing is a city that is growing so massively, and his recognition is happening at the exact moment that urban design is starting to become really formulated on ideas of trying to return the quality of the not the pre-urban, but of the European city. So he's saying what I'm seeing in the city around how it's growing compared to what urban designers are trying to do are incompatible with each other. So in other words, we're getting more and more nostalgic when this new situation is arising, when we've got less and less power to do anything about it. And so, this is where, he's saying that we're now left in a world without urbanism, only architecture, ever more architecture. And so this is a really important idea because of the fact that his one is that's a hint towards the idea of bigness, which we'll get to in a second. But also it reflects something that comes out in the strategies that we're seeing, which is what he talks about, this idea of the staging of uncertainty. And so what he's saying really is that if you can't control the city, because it's going to grow in this massive sort of way, what can you do? And so what he's really talking about is, again, systems. And so he's talking about the staging of uncertainty, where the uncertainty is the evolution that's already occurring. And he's saying that no longer, urbanism will no longer be concerned with the arrangement of more or less permanent objects, but with the irrigation of territories with potential. No longer aim for stable configurations, but the creation of enabling fields that accommodate processes that refuse to be crystallised into definitive form. It will no longer be about meticulous definition, the imposition of limits, but about expanding notions, denying boundaries, not about separating and identifying entities, but discovering unnameable hybrids. It's only going to be about the more and the modified. And so really what we're talking about, if you think about his processes in his projects, whether it be in Melon Sonat about locking down the void and ignoring the city, whether it be in La Villette about setting up a system inside which change could occur, whether you think about the use in the Bilgmamir project about inserting another system within an existing fabric, all of these are about staging uncertainty and recognising that processes are working. Now, this is a period where we're really talking a lot about program. And so it's interesting that in this sort of transition, there's a moment where there's a whole lot of people who work on these unbuilt projects for Koolhaas in his office that go on and start other firms that are now very, very significant. People like Bjarke Engels, people like MVRDV. And so even though these are urbanistic principles here, they're talking about principles of the landscape and working with the landscape. In a way, what he's talking about, principles that can also come into the design of a building. And here is an example of one from MVRDV, which is called Silo Dam. And it's really, it's based around in a way, this is like a spreadsheet or a diagram of functions that are overlaid onto the building in section that then produce the layout of the building, and from which then the building itself gets a kind of diagram. So there's a thing where colour and configuration of individual rooms becomes a kind of a rendering of this diagram of function. And so, as usual, what's really the aim is maximum complexification and maximum contradiction and maximum intersection between difference. And these are the main things that are happening. But this is actually the same as the urbanistic program of Koolhaas, but inside the scale of the building. And as if in anticipating this, in his book Content, which is quite amazing, which I have here, which is quite crazy. And by the way, a lot of the stuff we have is from this book, Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large. He does things where he has this thing called a patent office, where he basically says, I'm putting a patent on this strategy. And it's a way of recognising and telling the people who worked in his office, hey, these offices come from when you worked for me. And so you can see here there's a patent for his technique, the social condenser, as he calls it, for Lavalette. And here's a patent for Mellon Senart. And, there's a whole range of these patents that he puts over. But by this time, he's got to this point where, in actual fact, he's relegated architecture to the property section. So he's realised, I'm not interested in celebrating. Architecture is only property. It's not got the power, it's not got the magnificence. So I'm just, in the back of my book, I'm going to create a property section, which is about 10 pages long, which has all the built projects we've done in the last 20 years. And the rest of the book is about ideas and about strategies and all of these kind of things. I know I'm getting... And so you can see this sort of thing. And part of this also comes from a recognition of something that's talked about in bigness, which is around, and I think this is really important, around, let's go here first, where he says, beyond a certain critical mass, a building becomes a big building. Such a mass can no longer be controlled by a single architectural gesture or even by a combination of architectural gestures. Now, we can think about this as a building, but this is also, in a way, recognising that the shopping mall is increasingly the main urban structure we have. The relationship between the shopping mall and infrastructure, in a way, is one of the central things. And so what he's asking, as much as it can seem like it's, on the one hand, he's saying to architects, get over yourselves. You can't. If the city was too big for a single idea, now buildings themselves have become too big for a single idea. They're no longer able to be controlled. He's recognising that the city is now made of architecture and just more architecture. And in a way, the development process always moves towards consolidation. Subdivision may happen at one point to sell off the land, but after that, the timeless process of a city is consolidation. And more consolidation. And a lot of the time, urban design is fighting against these processes. So inevitably, we're moving towards the point where every block becomes one building. It's just a question of how long that will take. And so this is where it goes back to his point from Delirious New York of the world inside a building. Once the building gets to a certain size, you have to start retrofitting the world into it because of the fact that it's taken over. And it works its way through even worse, and this is where we get into things that we'll talk about more around building frontage. But as people want to consolidate to create bigger, easily managed lots, within that, people also want to create bigger and bigger floor sizes per unit to ease of rental for commercial, and then that affects the street. And so what he's really also talking about in this idea is the impossibility of this big building means that it triggers an autonomy of its parts. And so what he's interested here is that if you remember his idea about program, he's really interested in this idea that the possibility of it is the juxtaposition of program inside it. That there could be so much activity as program as event, that there's a sort of a frothiness to it. But in actual fact, we know that this is written a long time ago, and now we know it's full of franchises where it wouldn't matter whether you're in Constantia main mall or whether you're in the waterfront, you're going to see the same franchises in different places. So what do we have then? Drive on a motorway to a franchise. Why would one go to another place? And so these are the things he's saying. And so ultimately he's saying that the major thing about big buildings is fuck context. Because in actual fact, they are so large and so internalized that it makes no difference what happens. Instead, what he says is that we should be focusing on these things as the city. And so, or a system, pardon me. And so what happens is that the exterior of the city is no longer a collective theatre where it happens. There's no collective it left. The street has become residue, an organisational device, a mere fragment of a continuous metropolitan plain where the remnants of the past face the equipment of the new in an uneasy standoff. So in other words, this idea of the street as remnant, as a leftover from interiors of activity inside big buildings is a fundamental force. Now, the key difference is, this would be something that the new urbanists and he would agree on. But the difference is the new urbanists would be trying to reintroduce old ideas of the street to force it into shape, whereas his argument would be, how do we work with the complexity of it? How do we actually work with those sort of systems? And this is where, by creating a regulating structure or a strategy that can allow for difference, is for him to make the best out of it. As he says, business equals urbanism versus architecture. Now, in his own projects, by this stage, we're talking about he's by this stage started to build some projects of this scale, and one of those projects is in Lille. And so if you look at this, it's almost like he's sort of his own predictions about the city and how it will function are like this. And so for him, it's on the one hand, in the external sense, it's all about infrastructure. So it's all about the fact that this train goes to London, then it goes to Paris and Brussels. So it's about infrastructure. Then on the urban scale, it's about a series of very big buildings in terms of this bigness idea. And then other than that, it's all about particular sort of internal experiential qualities which are about celebrating infrastructure. So this is how his building plays out during this time. Now, if we think about just to move on and summarise, we're now at this point where Koolhaas's practice is starting to change, and he's starting to celebrate what in a way he would call the generic city. And the generic city for him, the ideal building for the generic city, for him the only distinctive place in the generic city is the airport, because it's now the model for everything else. You come in from somewhere else, you're dropped into a system that then plays itself out. And by now he's talking a lot of the time about Asian cities, but also about models that could fit for African cities. And so in the generic city is a city without history. It's equally exciting or unexciting everywhere. And so a lot of his model really was Singapore for this, but if, for instance, he goes on, as we'll say, to talk about Lagos. And so, he sort of says things like that because the city is about this sort of infrastructure, the generic city is about infrastructure to bigness volumes in a way. It's all also about, making everyone, he says, bridge and tunnel people, second-class citizens in our own civilization, because you're moving from one generic place to another generic place. And so he says the serenity of the generic city is achieved by the evacuation of the public realm. Now, this is more an Asian city probably than an African city. And so if we keep going on this, he also talks about this contradiction, which I find really interesting, is that he says, the supremely inorganic, the organic is the generic city's strongest myth. So, and he says, the street is dead. The discovery has coincided with frantic attempts at resuscitation. Public art is everywhere, as if two deaths make a life. Pedestrianisation intended to preserve merely channels the flow of those doomed to destroy the object of their intended reverence with their feet. He's talking here about tourism, for example. Everyone's searching for something which is distinctive in a place which is not distinctive. And so, he's also in this one point that's really interesting here, talking about Latin America more. He's saying the housing is not a problem. It's either been completely solved or completely left to chance. In the first case, it's legal. In the second, illegal. In the first case, towers or at least slabs. In the second, a crust of hovels. One solution consumes the sky, the other the ground. It's strange that those with the least money inhabit the most expensive commodity, earth, those who pay what is free, air. And so this is talking about, for instance, in Latin America, where gated communities and gated towers will be up like this, and then around that will be informal settlement. Now finally, at this point, there's a separation in Koolhaas's practice as he moves into, creates this thing called AMO, and AMO is OMA backwards, and the idea is working from east to west instead of west to east. And so this is part of a project that he undertakes to try to to try to understand the dynamics that are playing out in non-Western cities or in developing cities. And so what he does is he begins this series of kind of studies looking at those places with students from Harvard. And one of these that's really amazing is one that's on the Gulf, where, for example, he looks at what's been happening to the Gulf coastline. And they're starting to move into this thing of trying to understand things like how much oil that city has, when the oil will run out, how much infrastructure has been made during that period, and trying to sort of understand the dynamics or the conditions that cause the city to develop. By this time, he's given up on urbanism. So he's analysing and examining the city because he's in a way realised that the city is almost beyond hope, and that in a way his projects, he's now focusing on trying to read those cities almost from a kind of geographic perspective. He also did a project in Lagos, and it's interesting that he says here something which is, he says there's something really interesting about current urbanism. The only model is the universal model, and there is increasing incapacity to consider the virtues and qualities that are there and then to build on them. The thing is all about complete transformation. And in a way, that's by putting the urbanistic models that we've put to this point before the break, what I'm trying to do is in a way demonstrate to you that kind of body of urban thinking which is kind of universal. And then after the break, we'll talk about how it gets inflected by specific conditions. And he also talks about, something which would, this is like almost, this is like, should be a tweet from Helen Ziller, right? And so this is where he, I'm saying Godzilla is down the bottom there, but, so, it's interesting, like isn't this exactly what Helen Ziller said? The colonial is, you can't talk about anything implied, generosity implied by the colonial. And of course, this is where in South Africa we have the legacy of it is present as compared to an abstract idea, But he talks about how he ultimately had to stop working in Lagos because the amount of trouble he got into was from people's views about what he was doing was actually huge. So one thing that I think is also really interesting, is probably the useful point to end on, is he said the real thing we tried to look at in Lagos is what happens to a society when the state is absent. At that point, the state has withdrawn. The city was left to its own devices, and that there was a proliferation of individual agency within the city. And so this is the biggest contradiction that we face in talking about planning and urban design, is that this thing about the fact that we're surrounded by people who are living independently from the state, who have to be because they couldn't survive if they relied on the state. So this is what we would call informality. And they are prospering. And so this is the pervasiveness of the city being that's being made without any agency of the state. On the other hand, the architect is designing the big thing, the big building, which is a miniaturization of the world and is interiorized through security. And so in between those two poles, how do you reconcile those two things? And I think this is probably going to be the thing that we spend the rest of the semester looking at, is how you play between the relationship between the agency of the individual and the mechanisms of the state.